The Galactic Peace Summit on Vexar Prime was dissolving into chaos. 17 species, each with their own grievances, their own ancient feuds, their own biochemical triggers for aggression. The conference hall had become a cacophony of roars, clicks, subsonic rumbles, and electromagnetic pulses that made the translation devices spark and fail. Clara stood at the edge of the maelstrom, watching diplomats from across 3 spiral arms, bare fangs, extend claws, and activate bioweapons that shouldn't have made it past security. The Crothian ambassador had just thrown a chair, an impressive feat considering Crothians didn't normally recognize furniture as anything but obstacles. "Should we evacuate?" Jace asked beside her, his hand hovering over his emergency beacon. He was young for a human diplomat's age, barely 25, and this was his first interstellar incident. Clara didn't answer immediately. She was listening. Beneath the chaos, there was a pattern. The Vrel were hissing at a frequency that agitated the Crothians. The Crothians' aggressive pheromones were triggering the Sindrel's territorial displays. The Sindrel's electromagnetic field fluctuations were causing pain to the silicon-based architects. It was a cascade. Each species, inadvertently provoking the next. She stepped forward. "Clara, don't." Jace reached for her arm, but she was already moving toward the center of the chamber. What happened next would be analyzed by xenop psychologists for decades. Clara didn't shout. She didn't activate any technology. She simply stood in the middle of the riot and whispered. It shouldn't have worked. The human voice, even amplified, couldn't compete with a Crothian war bellow. But Clara understood something that most species had forgotten in their rush to colonize the stars. Communication wasn't just about volume. It was about timing, frequency, and the spaces between sounds. Her whisper came in those spaces. When the Vrel paused to draw breath, when the Crothian bellows crested and fell, when the electromagnetic chaos momentarily aligned, she whispered in perfectly calibrated intervals. Her words chosen not for their meaning but for their sonic properties. Sibilants to soothe the Vrel, hard consonants to ground the Crothians, rhythmic patterns that the architects could feel through vibration. The effect rippled outward. One by one, the delegates stopped. Not because they understood her words, the translation matrix was still fried, but because something in that whisper bypassed their conscious minds entirely. It spoke to older parts of their brains, the parts that recognized when a threat was calming, when chaos was resolving into order. Within 3 minutes, the riot had subsided. Within 5, delegates were returning to their seats, looking confused and slightly embarrassed. The summit continued. 3 treaties were signed that day. Clara became a legend. "Please, Ambassador Chen. You're our last hope." Clara looked at the desperate Tharn standing in her doorway, his 6 eyes blinking in asynchronous patterns that signaled extreme stress. Behind him, she could hear the sound that had apparently been echoing through the Tharn colony ship for 6 days straight. Screaming. High-pitched, relentless, and according to the audio files he'd sent ahead, capable of cracking pressure glass at certain frequencies. "The cubs won't sleep," the Tharn explained miserably. "We've tried everything. Temperature regulation, atmospheric adjustments, pheromone therapy, even sedatives, but human ethics observers won't let us use those on children. And honestly, we're not comfortable with it either. But Ambassador, we're reaching critical crew fatigue. Adults can't sleep through this. Systems are being neglected. We're going to have to abort our colonization mission and return to Tharn space, and—" "I'll help," Clara said, already reaching for her coat. Jace appeared at her elbow, datapad in hand. "Your schedule. Clear it." The Tharn colony ship smelled like cinnamon and ozone, a combination that Clara had learned to associate with Tharn emotional distress. As they walked through the corridors, adult Tharn pressed themselves against the walls, their ears flat against their skulls. Several were wearing improvised sound-dampening gear. The cubs were in the communal nursery, a large chamber that should have been filled with the soft lights and gentle sounds conducive to Tharn juvenile development. Instead, it looked like a war zone. shredded bedding everywhere, claw marks on the walls, and in the center, 12 Tharn cubs, each about the size of a human 5-year-old, screaming in a harmony that made Clara's teeth ache. "We've consulted every specialist," the administrator said helplessly. "They're not hungry, not injured, not sick. They're just refusing to sleep. And when Tharn cubs are overtired, they become more agitated, which makes them more resistant to sleep. It's a cycle," Clara finished. She stepped into the nursery. The cubs' eyes locked onto her immediately. Their screaming intensified. Tharn cubs were predators by nature, and they'd been bred by millions of years of evolution to make noise that would frighten away threats. Clara was definitely a threat, alien, unfamiliar, and stepping into their space. She tried her whisper. The cubs screamed louder. She tried sonic patterns that had worked on 14 different species. The cubs threw things at her, thankfully. Soft things. But the intent was clear. She tried standing perfectly still, projecting calm. The cubs interpreted this as a challenge and began posturing aggressively, their back fur standing on end. 3 hours later, Clara sat on the floor of the nursery, exhausted and nearly defeated. The cubs were still awake, still screaming, and now clearly overtired to the point of hysteria. Jace had brought her water and nutrient bars, which she'd consumed mechanically, while 12 pairs of predatory eyes tracked her every movement. "Maybe some problems don't have solutions," Jace said quietly. Clara looked at the cubs. At their dilated pupils, their trembling limbs, their stubborn, terrified refusal to show weakness by falling asleep. They were so young, so far from their homeworld, on a ship full of stressed adults, heading toward a colony planet they'd never seen. Without thinking, Clara began to hum. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't based on any xenopsychology research. It was just a melody her grandmother had sung to her, decades ago, before humanity had even made first contact. A simple tune, rising and falling like waves. The cub's ears twitched. Clara kept humming, letting the melody wander, adding small variations. She thought of her grandmother's hands, gently stroking her hair. She thought of safety, of home, of love that asked nothing in return. One cub sat down, then another. Clara began to add words, not in any language the cubs would understand, but words that felt right. She sang about stars and journeys, about courage and rest, about how even the strongest predators needed to close their eyes sometimes. The cubs were swaying now, their aggressive postures melting. One by one, they curled up on their bedding. Clara kept singing. She sang through the ache in her throat. She sang as 12 pairs of eyes slowly closed. She sang until the last cub's breathing deepened into sleep. And then she sang a little longer, just to be sure. In the doorway, the Tharn administrator stood with tears in all 6 eyes. Around the ship, crew members were stopping in corridors, listening to the sudden, blessed silence. Jace smiled. "Ambassador Chen," he whispered, "I think they're going to need you to come back tomorrow night." Clara looked at the sleeping cubs, at their peaceful faces, at the way they'd finally allowed themselves to be vulnerable. "Yeah," she said softly. Some problems, she'd learned, couldn't be solved with science or diplomacy or perfectly calibrated sonic frequencies. Some problems required something older, something humans had been doing since before they'd built cities or tamed fire. Some problems just needed a lullaby.